So picture this scenario for a second. An elderly man is trying to, just relax in a public bathhouse in the ancient city of Ephesus.
Right?
And this is not just any elderly guy. This is the Apostle John.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, the last surviving member of the original 12 disciples. So he is resting in the steam, and suddenly he sees another man walk into the building.
Just a random guy.
Well, no, that is the thing. John instantly panics. I mean, he scrambles to his feet, sprints out of the bathhouse completely naked, and starts screaming.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, screaming for everyone to flee into the streets before the roof caves in. He is shouting that the enemy of the truth is inside.
Right.
And that the judgment of God is about to bring the whole structure down. Now, on the surface, that sounds like the definition of an insane paranoid overreaction.
It really does. It sounds completely unhinged.
Right. But as we're going to see today, for the Apostle John, the theological stakes in that exact moment were quite literally life and death.
It is an incredibly visceral image to start with. And, that anecdote actually comes to us from the early church father Irenaeus.
So Irenaeus, right?
Yeah. And it sets the perfect tone for what we're looking at today. Because John was not reacting to a Roman soldier or like a government official coming to arrest him.
He wasn't running from the police.
Exactly. He was reacting to a man named Cerinthus, a theologian.
The theologian.
Yeah. And to understand why John reacted with such absolute terror, we really have to grasp the theology he was fighting against.
Which brings us to the core of what we are doing today. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are really glad you have pulled up a chair to the table with us today.
We definitely are.
Our objective for this deep dive is quite specific. We are looking at an intense set of theological commentaries, and they are analyzing a very concentrated section of Scripture.
1 John chapter 5, verses 1 through 5.
Right. And our goal is to unpack what these texts refer to as the infallible marks of the new birth. We want to understand how the original author linked faith, love, obedience, and total victory into a single unbreakable chain.
And as we work through this, we are going to rely on a reformed framework to understand the actual mechanics of what the Apostle John is laying out.
And we should probably establish right away that these verses are not dealing with casual suggestions for a better life.
No, not at all. The commentaries we are evaluating, they take very firm stances on massive centuries-old debates.
The monergism.
Yeah, monergism, which is the idea that God is the sole actor in human salvation. They also deal with the absolute necessity of the moral law.
And one of the sources even brings in highly specific end times timelines, like a pre-tribulation rapture and a literal millennial reign.
Right, which gets really detailed. And we are going to look under the hood of these doctrines, examine the Greek grammar, and try to figure out the why behind these passionate arguments.
And just a quick disclaimer for you listening at home, our goal here is to objectively analyze and report on the arguments presented in these texts.
We want to understand their logic.
Right. We are just conveying the ideas contained in the original source material without endorsing one side or the other of these specific theological debates.
So let us go back to Ephesus, somewhere between, say, AD 85 and 95.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, if you were listening to this and wondering why John was so on edge, we have to paint the picture of the city. Ephesus was a chaotic, wealthy, massive urban center.
Wasn't a quiet little village?
Oh, no. It was completely dominated by the Temple of Artemis, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
Oh, yeah.
The entire local economy revolved around paganism, idolatry, and temple prostitution. So the cultural pressure on early Christians to just blend in must have been suffocating.
It had to be. But here's the really striking detail the commentaries bring out.
What is that?
The biggest threat to this specific Christian community was not the pagan culture outside their doors.
Roman.
The Roman Empire was a threat, sure. The worshippers of Artemis were a threat, but the disaster that nearly destroyed this church was an internal defection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the call was coming from inside the house.
They were dealing with a church split.
A catastrophic one. A group of false teachers had infiltrated the congregation, sown an incredible amount of confusion, and then walked out.
Taking people with them, I assume.
Right, taking a large portion of the church with them. They fractured the community. And the specific threat was an early form of Gnosticism.
Ah, Gnosticism.
And that man in the bathhouse, Cerinthus, he was one of the primary architects of this movement.
So listen to what Cerinthus was actually proposing, because it sounds somewhat subtle at first, but it is essentially a spiritual...
A spiritual timeshare.
Yeah, timeshare, right.
But
Cerinthus was promoting a theology that separated the human Jesus from the divine Christ.
Okay, break that down for us.
So he taught that Jesus of Nazareth was just a normal, everyday, physical human being. Then, at his baptism in the Jordan River, this divine Christ Spirit descended upon him from heaven.
So the Spirit just moves in.
Right. And the Spirit empowered him to do the miracles, preach the sermons, draw the crowds. But the moment things got difficult.
Like right before the crucifixion?
Yeah, right before the cross, that divine Christ Spirit broke the lease and moved out. The Spirit went back to heaven, and the physical man Jesus died alone on the cross.
When you phrase it as a spiritual timeshare, it highlights the absurdity of the heresy, but it also reveals the catastrophic danger of it.
Oh, absolutely. This destroys the entire mechanical foundation of Christian salvation.
How so?
Well, under the Reformed understanding of the atonement, humanity has committed an infinite offense against an infinite holy God.
Right.
Therefore, the penalty for that offense must be infinite. A mere human being just suffering for a few hours on a Roman cross cannot pay an infinite penalty.
Because a regular man's life only has a finite value.
Precisely. Only God himself possesses infinite value. Therefore, the person on that cross had to be truly God and truly man simultaneously.
I see.
If the divine Christ leaves before the crucifixion, then the person bleeding out on that wood is just a guy from Nazareth. His death has no saving value for anyone else.
So Cerinthus was dismantling the incarnation and the substitutionary atonement in one single move.
He was removing the engine from the car and telling everyone they could still drive to heaven.
Wow. If you look at it through that lens, sprinting out of a bathhouse does not seem like an overreaction at all.
Not even a little bit.
It shows how severe the stakes were. I mean, if Cerinthus is right, Christianity is a complete fraud, and everyone is still condemned.
And the chaos did not stop at the cross. These early Gnostics also claimed to possess an elite, superior spiritual knowledge.
They thought they were the enlightened ones.
Exactly. They believed that the physical realm was inherently evil and the spiritual realm was inherently good.
Okay, so a hard split between the physical and the spiritual.
Yes. And because they possessed this secret spiritual enlightenment, they felt liberated from standard moral constraints in the physical world.
So they didn't have to follow the rules anymore.
Right. They looked down on the ordinary, working-class believers. They felt they were way above the basic rules of loving their neighbor, helping the poor, or following God's moral law.
They basically claimed to love God in the abstract, invisible realm, while treating actual human beings with complete contempt.
That is the perfect way to put it.
That context really explains the sheer trauma of the Ephesian church. I mean, imagine you were a first-century believer. People you took communion with, people you worshiped next to for years, are suddenly telling you the crucifixion was a sham.
And that basic morality is only for the unenlightened.
You would be reeling. And because they were dealing with this specific trauma, John had to construct his letter in a very specific, unbreakable way.
The literary structure here is vital to understand. The commentaries actually spend a good amount of time contrasting John's writing style with other biblical writers.
Like who?
Well, if you read the Apostle Paul, for example, in the book of Romans, he builds his arguments like a prosecuting attorney.
Step 1, step 2.
Yeah, it is a linear, step-by-step progression. Premise A leads to premise B, which results in conclusion C. He builds a logical staircase.
But John does not write like a lawyer. He writes more like a symphony conductor.
That is a highly accurate way to view it. The commentaries describe his structure as cyclical or symphonic.
Like a musical motif.
Yes. He introduces a theme, moves away from it to discuss something else, and then circles back to the original theme, but at a louder, more intense level.
Right, with more instruments playing.
Exactly. In this letter, he blends together three main tests of spiritual life over and over again.
The commentaries outline these three tests really clearly. First, there's the doctrinal test.
Which is?
Do you believe that Jesus is the incarnate Son of God and truly man?
Okay.
Second, the relational test.
Love.
Do you visibly love the brethren like the other Christians sitting right next to you? And third, the moral test. Are you actually keeping God's commandments?
And throughout the first 4 chapters, John hits these notes individually. But this brings us to chapter 5, verses 1 through 5.
The climax.
The commentators point out that this specific passage functions as the grand climax of the entire letter. It is the moment where John brings the doctrinal, relational, and moral tests together.
He synthesizes them into one single cohesive argument.
Yes.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might be wondering why John countered this elite, mystical, cosmic, Gnostic philosophy with such basic, grounded tests.
It does seem a bit simplistic at first glance.
Right. I mean, if the false teachers were talking about the high heavens and secret knowledge, why is John talking about something as ordinary as loving the annoying guy sitting across from you at dinner?
Because John's strategy is intentionally subversive. The false teachers were trying to elevate religion into the clouds. They wanted to make it an abstract, untouchable, invisible philosophy.
And John just drags it right back down to the dirt.
He does. He is establishing that true divine life does not float away from physical reality. It radically alters how you interact with physical reality.
You can't just have theoretical love.
No, you cannot claim to have invisible, mystical love for God while you visibly hate your brother. John binds the invisible spiritual reality to observable physical actions.
And the commentators issue a pretty severe warning right here. They argue that if you isolate chapter 5 from the rest of the letter, you fall straight into the trap of moralism.
Oh, easily.
You start looking at these 3 tests, believing, loving, obeying, as a checklist of chores you have to complete to earn your way into heaven.
Which completely contradicts the Reformed understanding of grace. The symphonic structure proves these virtues are not a checklist to earn salvation.
They are the visible fruit of a single, invisible root.
Exactly. You do not do these things to get life. You do these things because you already possess life.
That sets us up perfectly to look at the exact grammar John uses to prove that point. With this structural spiral understood, the commentaries zoom in on the absolute starting point of John's argument in verse 1.
And honestly, a single Greek sentence here drops a massive theological bomb regarding the mechanics of salvation.
The linguistic breakdown in these texts is really rigorous. Let us look at the first half of 1 John 5, verse 1.
Okay, what does it say?
In English it reads, "Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God."
Right. And to the casual reader today, that sounds like a very standard, simple sequence.
You make a decision to believe, and in response to that belief, God gives you the new birth.
But the commentaries bring out the Greek verbal tenses, and they completely invert that modern assumption.
They invert it entirely. Tell us about the verbs.
The text utilizes 2 very specific verb tenses. The phrase believes is translated from a Greek present active participle.
Present active. What does that mean practically?
This indicates an ongoing, continuous, habitual action. It is not a one-time event. It is a state of continually believing.
So it is not just walking down an aisle a decade ago and checking a box on a card.
No.
It is an active, present tense reality of trusting Christ today.
Correct. Now, contrast that with the second phrase, has been born of God.
Okay.
This is translated from a Greek perfect passive indicative.
Perfect passive. That sounds complicated.
It's actually pretty clear when you break it down. In Greek grammar, the perfect tense describes an action that was completely finished in the past, but the results of that action continue into the present.
Okay. Finished in the past, continuing results.
Yes. Furthermore, the passive voice means the subject did not perform the action. The action was performed upon them by an outside agent.
In this case, God.
Right. God did the birthing.
So if you are listening to this and wondering why we are spending so much time on first-century Greek verb tenses, think about the practical reality of what this means for human pride.
It changes everything.
The commentators use a Latin phrase here, ordo salutis, which translates to the order of salvation.
Right, the logical sequence of events.
Based on the grammar, the ongoing present belief linked to a completed past birth, the Reformed commentators argue fiercely that regeneration has to precede faith.
That is the core of their argument. They are stating that a person does not believe in order to be born again.
The birth happens first.
Yes. Instead, their ongoing active faith is the visible outward proof that God has already regenerated them in the past.
The invisible new birth causes the visible belief.
Right.
Let's put a real-world analogy on this. Think of a newborn baby in a hospital delivery room.
Okay.
The baby takes its first breath and lets out a loud cry. That cry does not cause the birth.
No, obviously not.
The baby does not cry to convince the mother to go into labor and deliver the child.
Right.
The cry is the physical, audible proof that the birth has already happened, that the lungs are functioning, and that life is present. The commentators are saying that faith is that first spiritual cry.
That visual captures the mechanics perfectly. And the commentators use this grammatical reality to launch a serious critique against opposing theological systems.
Specifically Arminianism.
Yes, they specifically challenge Arminianism. In very broad strokes, Arminianism, named after the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius, teaches that God provides a sort of prevenient grace to everyone.
Prevenient grace, meaning it comes before.
Right. And this grace levels the playing field and allows a person to use their free will to choose to believe.
So it's up to the human.
In that system, human faith is the catalyst, and God responds to that faith by granting the new birth.
But these sources are arguing for monergism.
Yes. The word monergism comes from two Greek words, mono meaning one, and ergon meaning work.
One worker.
It is the doctrine that there is only one worker in the act of regeneration, and that worker is God.
And they tie this directly to the Reformed doctrine of total depravity, don't they?
They do. And we should clarify, total depravity does not mean that every human being is as evil as they could possibly be.
Right, people still do nice things for their neighbors.
Exactly. It means that the corruption of the fall has extended to every part of the human condition, including the mind and the will.
The whole system is infected.
Yes. Humanity is so spiritually dead that a person literally cannot generate saving faith on their own. God has to perform the surgical act of the new birth first.
I have to introduce some friction here, because this is where modern listeners almost always hit a wall.
Go for it.
If the commentators are right, that man is totally passive in the new birth, and that God alone acts, how do they avoid the accusation that this strips away human free will?
That is the classic objection.
Does this not reduce human beings to robots who only believe because a divine software program was forcibly installed into their hard drive against their will?
I would not phrase it as a software program installed against their will. That implies a violation of the person's desires.
Okay, so how do they explain it?
The commentators address this by redefining how the human will actually functions in a spiritual context. They argue that an unregenerate person absolutely has a will.
They make choices.
They make choices every single day, and they choose freely according to their own nature. But because their nature is fallen and fundamentally hostile to God, they will always freely choose to reject him.
So they aren't being forced to sin.
No, they're not victims. They are willing slaves to their own desires.
So they are freely choosing from the menu, but their appetite is entirely opposed to the things of God.
Right.
It is not that they desperately want God but are blocked from choosing him. It is that, left to their own devices, they actively find him repulsive.
Precisely. What regeneration does, according to this monergistic framework, is change the appetite. It changes the nature.
The menu stays the same, but the cravings change.
Yes. God does not drag someone to Christ, kicking and screaming against their will. He gives them a new heart with new desire.
And once that happens,
Once that nature is changed, the blindness is removed. The person's will is free to see the actual beauty and value of Christ, and they freely, joyfully run to him.
so the passivity is only in the birth itself.
Yes, the passivity is only in that microsecond of the new birth. After that, the person is actively, continuously choosing to believe.
Which takes us right back to that present active participle we saw in the grammar.
Exactly.
So if faith is the first cry of this new life, the commentators argue that love and obedience are the ongoing vital signs.
The vital signs, I like that.
This moves us into verses 2 and 3, we can call the inseparable trio: faith, love, and law.
Okay.
John writes, "By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and observe his commandments."
You know, John does something rhetorically brilliant in verse 2. He completely flips the script on his own relational test.
How so?
Well, in chapter 4, John established a firm rule. You prove your invisible love for God by visibly loving the brethren. If you claim to love the God you cannot see, but you harbor hatred for the church member you can see, you are a liar. The visible love validates the invisible claim.
But right here in chapter 5, he reverses the flow of traffic.
He does.
Now he says that your love for the brethren is proven by loving God and keeping his rules. He is providing a boundary for what love actually looks like.
And the commentators view this reversal as a direct confrontation with modern subjective definitions of love.
Oh, for sure.
In contemporary Western culture, love is almost exclusively defined as unconditional affirmation.
Just accepting everything.
The cultural rule is very simple. If you genuinely love someone, you validate all of their choices, you affirm their self-identified truth, and you never, under any circumstances, make them feel judged.
But the texts are arguing that biblical love can never be separated from God's moral law. It is not just a squishy, sentimental feeling of affirmation.
Right.
But why? I mean, why is it so dangerous from their perspective to separate love from the law?
Because, in the Reformed view, God's moral law is not an arbitrary set of rules designed to ruin everyone's fun.
It's not just a cosmic killjoy.
Exactly. The law is the divine blueprint for human flourishing. God designed human beings to operate in a specific way.
Like a manufacturer's manual.
Yes. Therefore, true love for another person must be governed by what God defines as good.
So you can't redefine good on your own terms.
No. You cannot truly love a fellow believer by encouraging them or affirming them in behavior that God clearly states will destroy their soul.
That makes sense.
True love is seeking the brother's ultimate good under the authority of God's design. It ties human affection directly to divine law.
And then verse 3 delivers a statement that I find incredibly striking and frankly a bit hard to swallow on a surface reading.
What is that?
It says, "His commandments are not burdensome."
Ah, yeah.
The commentators spent a significant amount of ink analyzing this concept because for the unregenerate person, the moral law of God is a crushing, terrifying weight.
It is an impossible standard of perfection that constantly condemns them and highlights their failure.
But for the regenerate person, the dynamic entirely shifts.
To understand this, we need to introduce a concept the commentators rely on, known as the three uses of the law in Reformed theology.
Okay, the three uses. Walk us through them.
The Reformers categorized how the law functions. The first use is like a mirror. It shows you your sin and drives you to Christ for mercy.
So it exposes the dirt on your face.
Right. The second use is like a bridle. It restrains evil in society through the threat of punishment.
Keeping civil order.
Exactly. But it is the third use that John is talking about here.
The third use is for the believer. Right?
Yes. The third use of the law is for the Christian. For the believer, the law acts as a map or a guide.
Okay.
The commentators argue that because the believer has been given a new disposition, a new heart through regeneration, the law ceases to be an oppressive, condemning burden.
Now, to be clear, they still battle sin. They still stumble.
Oh, of course. But their fundamental relationship to the rule book has changed. The law becomes a delight.
A delight.
Yeah, a detailed guide for how to live out their new nature and please the Father they now love.
There's a really vivid analogy mentioned in one of the texts to explain this. The eagle's wings.
I love that one.
Think about the law of gravity. Gravity is an unyielding law that constantly pulls things down toward the earth.
Right.
To a creature without wings, like a turtle, the law of aerodynamics might seem like an impossible, frustrating barrier.
Because the turtle can't fly.
Right. But to the eagle, the law of aerodynamics does not restrict it. It is the very mechanism that allows it to fly.
That's a great image.
The eagle's nature is designed to interact with that law joyfully. The commentators are saying that the new birth gives the believer the wings to interact with God's law joyfully.
That analogy clarifies the mechanics of the third use of the law perfectly.
It really does.
The law does not give the eagle life, and the law does not save the believer, but it guides the believer's grateful response to having been given life.
Let me push back on this a bit, because we live in an era where many people who grew up in the church view strict commandment keeping as toxic legalism.
That is a very common sentiment today.
How do the commentators reconcile this intense demand for obedience with the concept of grace? Does focusing this heavily on keeping the rules not just recreate the exact Pharisaical system that Jesus constantly condemned?
That is a very fair question, and the commentators answered that critique by pointing right back to the sequence we established in verse 1.
The order of operations.
The order of operations is everything. Legalism says, obey the commandments, get your life together, and then God will love you and give you life.
Which is exhausting.
It is a crushing burden because it relies on flawed human effort to earn salvation. John's sequence is the exact opposite.
Right.
He says, God has already given you life. God has already given you his love. Therefore, as a result, you obey.
So the engine driving the obedience completely changes. It goes from fear to gratitude.
Yes. The obedience is no longer a wage paid to a harsh taskmaster to avoid being fired. It's totally different.
It is the natural family resemblance of a child imitating a father they adore. The commentators argue vigorously that severing obedience from grace is not freedom, it is antinomianism.
Let us define that for the listener. Antinomianism, against, and nomos, meaning law.
Against the law.
Antinomianism is the belief that because we are saved by grace, the moral law no longer applies to us at all. We can just live however we want.
And John is combating that directly. The commentators insist that true grace always, without exception, produces a desire for holiness.
Always.
Always. If there is no desire for obedience, there is no evidence of the new birth.
But that desire for holiness, that alignment with God's law, inevitably puts the believer in a state of direct, unyielding conflict with their surrounding environment.
You're going to stand out.
Yeah, if you start living according to a completely different blueprint, the world is going to notice. Which pushes us into the fifth section of our analysis, the cosmic battle and the concept of the cosmos.
We are looking at verses 4 and 5 now, right, where John talks about overcoming the world.
To fully grasp the magnitude of this conflict, we really have to look at the specific Greek word John uses for world, which is cosmos.
Cosmos.
The commentators provide a fascinating linguistic contrast here. In ancient Greek philosophy, particularly among thinkers like Pythagoras, the word cosmos referred to the beautiful, highly adorned, perfectly ordered arrangement of the universe.
So it was a positive word.
Very positive. It was a term of aesthetic and systematic perfection. It is actually where we get the English word cosmetics.
Interesting. But John completely subverts that classical usage.
He does.
He takes this word that means a beautiful, ordered system, and he turns it into a theological weapon.
He absolutely does. In Johannine literature, the cosmos is indeed an organized system, but it is organized in tonal unified rebellion against God.
It's an anti-God system.
Yes, it is a satanically orchestrated matrix of human society, philosophy, and culture, arrayed in hostile defiance against its creator.
And what runs this system?
The commentators point out that earlier in this letter, John explicitly stated that this system operates on three specific principles.
Okay, what are they?
The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life.
You know, I think the best way to visualize John's concept of the cosmos is to compare it to an artificial intelligence matrix from a sci-fi movie.
I like where this is going.
Imagine a scenario where humans are plugged into a massive, highly ordered digital simulation.
Okay.
The system is designed to look beautiful, to appeal directly to their physical desires, and to keep them endlessly distracted with entertainment and status.
So it feels good to be inside it.
Right? But the core function of the matrix is malicious. It is designed to keep its inhabitants asleep, enslaved, and completely hostile to the true reality outside the simulation.
That is a brilliant way to picture it.
John is arguing that the world system, the cosmos, is a spiritual matrix designed to keep humanity blind to the glory of God.
And John makes a definitive claim in verse 4. Whatever is born of God overcomes this matrix.
It beats the simulation.
Exactly. The new life injected by regeneration cannot be permanently contained or neutralized by the cosmos. And the specific instrument of this victory, according to the text, is faith.
And notice what it is not.
Right.
The victory is not achieved through sheer human willpower. It is not achieved through political dominance or passing better legislation or taking over the cultural institutions.
The instrument of victory is faith.
Because faith is the mechanism that unites the believer to Christ.
And Christ is the ultimate overcomer. The commentators stress that Christ defeated the world system comprehensively at the cross and the empty tomb.
He beat the matrix.
He exposed the world's judgment as fraudulent and its power as temporary. The believer shares in that exact victory solely through their spiritual union with him.
Now, here is where we need to look at how different theological frameworks handle this text.
It's really interesting.
One of the commentators takes this concept of overcoming the world in a very specific, detailed direction.
Yes, they do.
This author connects the idea of victory in verse 4 to a highly detailed eschatological framework, specifically dispensationalism.
A pre-tribulation rapture and a literal millennial reign of Christ on earth.
For listeners unfamiliar with those terms, dispensationalism is a theological system that divides history into distinct eras, or dispensations, in which God administers his purposes in different ways.
A key feature of this system is maintaining a sharp distinction between the nation of Israel and the Christian church.
Right, and the specific commentator argues that because Christ triumphs spiritually, believers will physically and geopolitically overcome the world when Christ returns.
They argue he will rapture the church out of the world before a 7-year period of global tribulation.
Followed by a literal 1,000-year reign on earth where the cosmos is finally subjugated by force.
And if you are tracking with the flow of John's argument, you have to ask a structural question here.
I definitely am. How does this commentator logically move from a present-day, localized spiritual battle against the cosmos like battling pride and lust in your daily life right now, to future apocalyptic events involving a rapture and a millennium.
It seems like a massive leap.
Is that not taking John's pastoral encouragement to an embattled first-century church and mapping it onto a highly specific future calendar that is not actually present in these 5 verses?
That is a very common critique of reading dispensationalism into this specific text.
Reformed covenant theology views it differently, right?
Generally, yes. They would interpret the victory here much more presently and spiritually without requiring a future millennial kingdom to validate it.
Okay, so how does the dispensational commentator justify it?
But the dispensational commentator gets there by linking the concept of Christ's victory in verse 5 to the ultimate physical consummation of that victory.
So they are pulling from the book of Revelation to interpret 1 John.
Exactly. They argue that if faith guarantees total victory over the world system, that victory cannot remain purely spiritual or internal forever.
It has to have a physical reality eventually.
Right. It must eventually manifest in a literal, physical, visible triumph over the governments, economies, and structures of this earth.
For this author, the present spiritual reality demands a future geopolitical fulfillment.
Yes. While the text of 1 John stays heavily focused on the present tense, this is the victory that overcomes, the source author extrapolates that theological concept to include their specific understanding of the end times.
It is a clear example of how a single concept like victory can be interpreted through very different systematic lenses.
It really is.
But regardless of their eschatology, all the commentators agree on the immediate practical weight of this passage.
They all feel the urgency.
Which brings us to the final major section of our analysis, the two-edged sword of application.
Because this text describes a literal life and death battle with the cosmos, the authors apply these verses with striking urgency to the modern listener.
They do not treat this as abstract history.
Not at all. The commentators outline a dual intended effect of John's writing. It is meant to do 2 very different things to 2 very different types of people.
Okay, lay that out for us.
On one hand, John intends to absolutely crush the false assurance of hypocrites.
Hypocrites.
Yeah, people who claim to know God, who sit in the pews, but who show zero evidence of a changed life.
Zero love for the brethren and zero desire to obey God's law.
Exactly. On the other hand, the text is meant to provide a healing balm to broken-hearted, trembling saints who are terrified they might not be genuinely saved because they still struggle with sin.
To highlight why they feel this aggressive two-edged application is so necessary today, the sources cite some startling statistics.
From a recent State of Theology survey.
Yeah, conducted by Legionnaire Ministries. They look at the modern visible church and point out that 43% of self-identified evangelicals view Jesus only as a good moral teacher.
Not as the incarnate God.
Right. And furthermore, 56% of these self-identified evangelicals accept religious pluralism.
The believing that God accepts the worship of all religions as equally valid paths to heaven.
Those numbers are staggering when you consider the historical context we opened with.
They really are. Those statistics represent the exact heresy Cerinthus was teaching in the 1st century.
The guy in the bathhouse?
Yes. It is the exact same Gnostic impulse, diminishing the unique, exclusive deity of Christ and suggesting alternate mystical paths to truth.
The commentators view these survey numbers as proof of a massive theological crisis in contemporary Western Christianity.
And because of this crisis, the commentators view 1 John chapter 5 as a severe diagnostic tool.
They use it to evaluate everything.
They launch a heavy attack on modern church trends, specifically targeting the seeker-sensitive movement, pastoral pragmatism, and liberal theology.
They accuse these modern movements of watering down John's rigorous tests to make the religion more palatable to a culture that hates absolute truth.
Yes. They argue that by lowering the bar for what constitutes a Christian, the modern church is filling its buildings with unregenerate people.
Therefore, the commentators demand visible, tangible obedience as the necessary proof of the invisible reality of the new birth.
One of the sources specifically uses the ordinance of believers' baptism as a primary example.
Baptism, okay.
They are very careful to argue that the physical water of baptism does not save a person.
Because that would violate monergism and grace.
Right, but they argue it is the first required outward proof of the inward new birth. It is the first public test of obedience.
So refusing to be baptized, in their view, casts severe doubt on the validity of someone's profession of faith.
Because it shows a refusal to submit to Christ's explicit command.
I hear the intensity of this application, and I have to ask about the psychological weight of this doctrine for the person sitting in the pew.
It is heavy.
If you are a listener trying to apply this to your own life, the tests of true faith here are rigorous. They are uncompromising.
John demands orthodox doctrine regarding the incarnation, constant sacrificial love for the church, and joyful obedience to the moral law.
Right. And does that standard not naturally create a culture of massive anxiety and paranoia in a congregation?
It certainly can.
If I am constantly checking my own fruit to see if my invisible root is real, how do I ever have a moment of peace? How do the commentators balance the terror they want the hypocrite to feel with the assurance they want the genuine believer to have?
That tension you just described is the central pastoral challenge of this text. And the commentators spend a lot of time addressing it.
How do they resolve it?
They attempt to resolve this anxiety by continually pointing the believer away from their own performance and back to the object of their faith.
Back to Jesus Christ.
Yes. They argue that if you look inside yourself for your primary source of assurance, you'll always find failure, inconsistency, and despair.
Because we still sin.
Right. The law, even the third use of the law, will always expose your weakness and how far short you fall.
So you cannot find lasting assurance by staring at your own fruit.
No, you cannot. The evidence of love and obedience confirms that life is present, but your performance is not the source of your peace.
Where does the peace come from?
The commentators state that true, lasting assurance comes when the trembling believer recognizes their own weakness, admits their failure, and clings desperately to the fact that Christ has already overcome the world on their behalf.
Oh, that's good.
The marks of the new birth, faith, love, and obedience are not demanded as a standard of sinless perfection.
If they were, no one would be saved.
Exactly. They are demanded as a general trajectory of a changed life.
It's about the direction of the ship, not whether it takes on a little water during the storm.
That is the perfect way to summarize it. When a believer sees a desire for holiness in their life, even a struggling, faltering desire, they should take that as evidence of God's regenerative work and find comfort in his sovereign grace.
What about the hypocrite?
The hypocrite feels no conviction about the water filling the boat. They do not care, and they might even enjoy the water.
But the true believer is furious about the water.
Right. The true believer furiously bails the water out because they care deeply about reaching the destination. The commentators argue that this text should terrify the person who is comfortable and complacent in their sin while comforting the person who is exhausted from battling it.
That is a very clarifying distinction.
Yeah.
As we bring all these theological concepts together, we can really see the full picture of what these commentators are arguing.
It is a massive picture.
They're telling us that, according to the Apostle John, true spiritual life cannot be fragmented into pieces.
No.
You cannot choose to take the doctrine but reject the morality. You cannot take the love but reject the theology. It is an all-or-nothing reality.
It is presented as a singular, unbroken sequence of divine action and human response.
Let us review the chain one more time.
Okay. God sovereignly begets new life in a spiritually dead person.
Right.
That new life immediately produces an active, ongoing faith in the true, historical, incarnate Son of God.
And
That faith inevitably produces a supernatural love for other members of God's family.
that love naturally expresses itself through a joyful obedience to God's moral law.
Exactly. And that obedience, fueled entirely by faith in Christ, ultimately triumphs over the rebellious world system.
It is a completely closed-loop system of Reformed theology. Every single part depends entirely on the part that came before it.
And it leaves absolutely zero room for the cultural idea of a casual believer.
It destroys the notion of someone who agrees with the theology intellectually, maybe attends a service on a holiday, but lives a life completely detached from the ethical requirements of the kingdom. We have covered a massive amount of theological ground today, looking at these intensely detailed arguments about grammar, church history, and the mechanics of salvation.
It was a lot to get through.
But we want to leave you with a challenging idea to ponder on your own, something that builds on the text but takes it a step further into your daily routine.
Think back to our discussion on the cosmos.
That highly organized matrix of rebellion.
Right. The system that operates on the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life.
If the cosmos is truly a highly organized system, specifically designed to blind its inhabitants, as these sources suggest, we have to ask a difficult, practical question.
What is that?
How much of what we consider standard, everyday, normal culture is actually subtle conditioning designed to pull you away from these truths?
That is a scary thought.
When you scroll through your social media feed for an hour, when you watch the latest streaming series, or when you listen to the prevailing financial or relational wisdom of modern society, How much of it is truly neutral?
Probably very little.
And how much of it is the cosmos actively running its code in the background, appealing to your pride to keep you asleep to the reality of God?
It forces you to evaluate your environment not just as a passive backdrop to your life, but as an active participant in your spiritual formation.
It requires a constant state of vigilance.
It definitely changes how you view the glowing screen in your pocket.
Thank you for joining us at the table today for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Keep questioning, keep analyzing the text, and we will see you next time.